Hey guys, in this video I'll be going over taxi, takeoff, and landing for the Viggen. Let's go over taxi first. First, make sure your master mode is in navigation. Next, you need to turn off the parking brake. If the parking brake's on, this lever here will be pulled out. So you just press on your pedals and then release them to turn it off. Then you just move your throttle forward to start moving, and you move the pedals left and right to turn. The Viggen also has a thrust reverser. If you pull this lever back, you'll see this green light will turn on. Now, when I increase the throttle, the plane will move backwards. Be careful with the thrust reverser because if you're moving backwards and you hit the brake pedals, your plane could flip backwards. Alright, now let's go over takeoff. First, you need to input your runway heading into the navigation computer. You might be wondering, why do I need to do this? The reason why is because when you take off, the navigation system sets the initial heading, and it uses this initial heading during your flight. When you take off, it checks what runway heading you put in the computer, and it looks at what heading the compass is showing during takeoff, and it makes sure they're pretty much the same, and it makes some small corrections if it needs to. If the heading that is put into the computer is pretty off, if it's 10 or 15 degrees off, then the navigation system is going to make some adjustments, and it thinks it's going to be correcting it, but actually it's going to show a wrong heading. That's why it's really important when you take off that you put the right takeoff heading into your computer. In most missions, the way the mission is set up in DCS, most of the time the Viggen is already going to know what your takeoff airbase is, and it's already going to know what the runway heading is. But you should always double check it to make sure it's correct, and sometimes it might be wrong, and you might have to manually input the heading, especially if you're not taking off from an airport, if you're taking off from a road base or something like that. The way that you check your heading is click this LS button, which is the takeoff point. You go to the computer here and you set it to Bana Grands, and make sure this switch is set to output, and you can see the takeoff heading here. Ignore these last two numbers, that is for something I'll talk about later, but these first four numbers are your takeoff heading. You can see 250.0 degrees. In this case, it's actually incorrect. My takeoff heading, if I look at my compass, should be 70 degrees here. The reason why is because right now I am at Kobyuleti Airport, and the navigation computer thinks I want to take off on the other side of the runway. It thinks I want to take off on 25. That's why it has 250 degrees. If you are in this situation, there's a really easy way to switch it to the opposite heading. All you do is you click this button that says LS, and now it switches it to the opposite, 70 degrees, which is correct because I am on runway 07. In this case, this is not really a big deal. Even if I had it set back to 250, while I'm taking off, the computer is smart enough that it could recognize I'm on the other side of the runway, and it wouldn't cause any problems. So I'm just going to go ahead and set it to runway 7 so it can be correct. But in this situation, you wouldn't even have to fix it. The situation where you would need to manually put it in is if there was no heading at all, if it was just all zeros, or if it was completely off. For example, right now I'm facing 70 degrees, but let's say I check the heading and it says 85. Obviously that's completely off and I would need to fix it. And also, like I mentioned earlier, if I'm at a road base, the computer is not going to have the road base pre-programmed in. It only has airports programmed in. So if I was at a road base, I would have to manually type in the heading. If you want to manually type the heading in, all you do is make sure this is set to Bana Grands and set this to input, and you just type in your heading. So let me just do 0852, and then you click LS, and then switch this back to output, and now you can see it is 85.2 degrees. This is incorrect. I want to switch it back to what it really should be, which is 70 degrees, so I'm going to go to input, 0700, click LS, output, and now 70 degrees, which is correct. If I had it set to whatever it was before, I think it was like 80 degrees, if I were to just leave it to 80 degrees, which is incorrect because you can see I'm actually at 70 degrees right now, then when I take off, the navigation system would think there's something wrong with the compass, and it would make an adjustment, and that would be bad because it's making an incorrect adjustment, and it would set all my headings off in the plane. So that's why it's really important to always make sure you have the correct heading dialed in. If your heading is very off, for example, when I had 80 degrees in here earlier, that's only 10 degrees off, so that would make an incorrect adjustment. If it's very off, if it's I think more than 15 degrees, let's say it was 40 degrees off, in that case, the plane would not even make an adjustment. If it was something like 40 degrees off, the plane would be able to tell this is such a big difference that something's definitely wrong here, and in that case, it wouldn't even make a correction. It would just do nothing. So if you are off in your heading by a small amount, by like 10 degrees, in that case, the navigation system would make an adjustment and it would be wrong and it would set your heading off. If your heading was off by a lot, by let's say 40 degrees, in that case, the navigation system would understand, okay, the compass is not off. The pilot must have just input an incorrect runway heading. And in that case, it wouldn't make any adjustment at all, and you would get a warning here that says nav system. So if you're flying and you get a warning here that says nav system, that means you probably had the wrong heading input. If that warning happens, it's not a big deal because the nav system didn't make an adjustment at all and you're probably fine. One last thing to talk about with this runway heading. When you're taking off on a runway, if the runway is not slippery and if there's not strong crosswind, then in that case, all you got to do is set your runway heading and you're good to go. You can take off and the navigation system will automatically make any corrections if the compass is off. However, if you're taking off with really strong crosswinds that could cause your nose to move back and forth, the navigation system might make a wrong correction. For example, let's say you're taking off with a strong crosswind and let's say it blows your nose 10 degrees to the left. The nav system might make an adjustment to the compass because it thinks the compass is off, but in reality it was just the wind was pushing your nose. If you're in that situation where you're taking off with a really strong crosswind, what you want to do is you want to tell the navigation system your heading. You want to basically manually input the heading so it calculates the correction right there instead of calculating it during takeoff. The way that you need to do that is you make sure your plane is perfectly lined up in the middle of the runway, and then you click this button that says reference button. It doesn't have a default key binding, so you need to bind it to your keyboard or your stick. So what you do is you line your plane up perfectly with the runway and you click the reference button. And in that case, you are manually telling the navigation system during takeoff, ignore whatever happens, ignore whatever direction my nose faces. Just whatever I'm facing right now, this is the correct heading. And the navigation system will compare that to whatever heading is input and it will make any minor corrections if it needs to, or if it's the same, it won't do anything. I know this might have been a little bit confusing, so in summary, when you take off, just set this to Bana Grands, make sure the heading is correct, and right before you take off, if it's really windy, if there's a strong crosswind, then just make sure you're lined up with the runway and hit the reference button. If there's not any crosswind, then you don't need to do that. Okay, now let's continue with takeoff. Next, you need to check that this is on, this button that says Spock. If it's off, you just click it and the light will turn on. This is a stabilizer for the flight controls. Here is how the takeoff is going to work in the Viggen. The Viggen has 3 stages for the afterburner. You can look at these stages here. There's these lights. Whenever you're on stage 1, this first light will come on, and then 2 and 3. If you're taking off on a normal runway, you want to take off with stage 2 afterburner. If you're on a short runway, you want to do stage 3 afterburner. When you're taking off, there are these 2 lines here on the bottom of the HUD. When you're getting faster, there will be a line in the middle that starts growing outwards. And once it reaches these bars on the end, that is when you pull up. So you can look at that if you want to, or you can just look at your speed gauge, and you pull up at around 250 kilometers an hour. So you can just look at this if you want. Let me go into stage 2 burner now. There's 1. And there's 2. You can use your rudder pedals to keep you in the center line. And you can see this horizontal line on the bottom that's going to grow toward the outer bars. Once it hits the outer bars, you can pull up. Be careful not to pull the stick too far back on the Viggen because it's really easy to tail strike in this plane. Once you take off, you raise the landing gear with this lever back here on the left, and you can turn the afterburners off. Last thing you do is you can set your HUD to the upper position by clicking this button here. That makes it a little bit easier to see. One last note, if you're taking off with stage 3 afterburner, the plane gets fast really quickly, so once you get off the runway, make sure you raise the gear, because if you get too fast before you bring the gear up, it could jam the gear. So just be careful if you're in stage 3 afterburner. That was takeoff in the Viggen. Now let's go over landing. First, I'm going to go over how to set up the landing for the Viggen. Then I'm going to go over the 3 different ways you can land. There's 3 landing modes in the Viggen. And then I'll go over the TILS landing. First, let's go over the setup. You need to make sure you have your landing base plugged in as a waypoint. You can manually type in the coordinates if you want to, and you're going to have to do that if you're landing on a road base. But if you're landing at an airport, the Vigen has a database in the computer with a bunch of the coordinates for a bunch of airports already plugged in. And all you do is you have to type in a code, and it will already set up everything for you. I'll show you how to do that first, and then after that, I'll show you how to manually put in a waypoint if you need to do that. You need to open the kneeboard, hold right shift on your keyboard and click K, and it will open the kneeboard, and you can use these arrows down here. And you need to go over to this page that says air bases at the top. And you hold right shift and you click page up and page down to cycle through all the different air bases. And you need to find the one you want to land at. I want to land at Kobuleti, so let me find Kobuleti, and here it is, and here's the code, 9013. So all I have to do is plug in this code, and it will put Kobuleti's coordinates into my landing waypoint, and it will put in the runway heading. And it will also put in the TILS code, and I'll talk about the TILS later. The way you do this is you go to the computer and you set this switch to ref Lola, and you set it to input, and you type in the code 9013, and then you click LMAL here. When we were taking off earlier, we were doing this one, LS. So LS is for takeoff, LMAL is for landing. So I click LMAL and set this to output and set this to active position. And you can see I still have waypoint 1 selected, so let me click LMAL now. And you can see now I have L1, landing 1. So now I should have Kobuleti's landing coordinates plugged into the plane. If you're hitting the LMAL switch and L1 is not coming up here, it might be because this is not in active position. If I have my waypoint 1 selected and I set this to ref Lola, and then if I set LMAL, it still says waypoint 1 here. So make sure this is active position and then hit LMAL. And now I have my waypoint selected. That was how you set up your waypoint for an airbase. Now let's say you're flying to a road base and you need to plug the coordinates in manually. In that case, you do the same thing. You go back to reference Lola and you set this to input. And this time you need to plug your coordinates in. So let's just say I'm landing on this runway here. It's not an actual air base in game, it's just a little target range. So what you do is once you're in the F10 map, you hold left Alt on your keyboard, and then you left click on wherever you want to land. And it's going to drop down a little circle, and it's going to come up with this little box here. You get back in your cockpit. Now we have the coordinates we can plug in. If you're used to American airplanes, in American planes, you type in the north coordinate first and the east coordinate. The Vigen is a little bit different. You type in the east coordinate first and then the north coordinate. The type of coordinates the Vigen uses are these ones here, lat long standard. Let me type in the east first. So 41, 47, 52. And you can see once I type the east coordinate in, it changes all back to zeros. So now it's ready for the north coordinate. 41, 50, 31. Once you type those coordinates in, it's going to cycle between the two coordinates so you can read them and make sure they're correct. And then what you need to do is you need to click the LMAL button, and you can get rid of this little box by clicking OK. And I'm going to set this back to output and back to active position and click LMAL. And now my landing position should be set to this little box right here. Now, whenever you're plugging in manual coordinates for your landing position, you also need to type in the landing runway heading. What you do is you just get your runway heading for landing. So what you can do is you can click in your F10 map, you click this up here. This is the ruler tool. And you can right click on the beginning of your runway and right click on the end. And you can see the degrees here. There's going to be 2 degrees. The blue one is magnetic and the black one is true. The Vigen uses true heading, so my degrees would be 162. So to put in your runway angle for landing, you make sure you got your landing waypoint selected. So let me click LMAL. Then set this to Bana Grands and set this to input. And type in your true heading. Let me type in 162. And it uses 4 digits, so I'll just put a 0 after. And then you can click LMAL and set this to output. And now my landing heading is 162. You might be wondering, why do I need to put in 4 digits if there's 6 here? The reason is because these last 2 digits are an ILS code for an airport. And since if you're going to land on a road base, obviously there's no ILS. So that's why you only put in 4 digits here. Now, I'm not going to actually land at this road base. I'm going to land at Kobuletti. So let me go ahead and put back in the code for Kobuletti. The code was 9013, so I just do ref Lola input 9013 and click lmol. And you can see now I got Kobuletti plugged in. If you're using a code to put in your airbase and the coordinates for landing, it's going to automatically have the runway headings, but it might be on the wrong side. You can see for Kobuletti, it set up my heading as 250, but the thing is that 250 is this side of the runway. I want to land on runway 07. If that's the case, what you do is you set this to Bana Grands and set this to output, and then you just click lmol, and you can see it switched it to the other side of the runway now, 07. Then you just set it back to active position. Also, if you're landing on an airport with multiple runways, it might have one of the runway headings plugged in, but it might not be the one you want to land on. If that's the case, you're going to have to manually plug in the heading, and you just do that the same way I showed you with the road base. That was how you set the plane up for landing. Now let's go over how to actually land it. There's 3 different landing modes. There's visual landing, navigation landing, and there's another one called flip-flop landing. Let's do visual landing first. When you're doing visual landing, what you do is you select your landing waypoint with lmol. You make sure the mode is in navigation, and on your radar, make sure your radar's on first of all. You use this switch right here to turn your radar on. If it's at A0, it's off. You want it to be on A1 to turn it on. And once your radar is on, you're going to see a circle, which is where your airport is you want to land at, and you're going to see a line sticking out of the circle. That is the heading you want to be on when you're landing. If you can't see the circle, you might need to zoom in or zoom out on the radar. If you need to zoom in or zoom out, you need to use these commands here, radar range decrease and radar range increase. I'd recommend binding them to your stick so I can zoom in like this and I can zoom out also. So I'm going to set the radar range to 60 kilometers, and now you can see my airbase pretty well. So what you need to do is you basically just need to fly over towards where your airbase is, and you want to fly towards this line here. You want to basically get to the end of this line, and once you get there, you want to turn and face towards the circle, and that means you will be lined up for landing. Now your line might be sticking out the other side. As you can see, it might be like this, sticking out the other side. If that's the case, just do what I said earlier. All you got to do is come to your computer and set it to Bana Grands, and then click lmol, and it will switch the heading to the other side of the runway, and you can see now the line is sticking out on the right side. So I'm going to go ahead and fly over to my runway. Once you flew to the end of the line, now all you have to do is turn toward the airport, and you should be pretty much at the right angle for landing. The way you can tell where the airport is you look at this yellow marker. That is the direction of the airport. And if I look out, you can see there's the airport out there. I'm going to put the plane in active pause and go over how to land it from here. First, you need to lower the HUD. If you click this here, the HUD drops down, so now it's easier to see. Then you need to make sure you have your altitude mode on radar. With this switch here, if it's on the right, it's going to be barometric altitude, so you click it to the left to set it to radar so it'll be more accurate. Also, make sure the HUD slave is turned on. This switch right here, make sure it's on the right. That turns on the HUD slave, and what that does is it declutters the HUD at low altitudes so it's easier to see. Then if it's dark outside, you can turn on the landing light. The switch for it is kind of hard to see. It's down here on the left. It's this switch right here. Now you need to slow the plane down to lower the gear. So bring your throttle back and watch your speed gauge, and you want to get down to 550 kilometers per hour to lower the gear. If you need to slow down quickly, you can use the air brake. The key bindings for it are right here. It's air brake out and air brake in. Once you get down to 550 kilometers per hour, you can lower the gear. Back here on the left, click this lever to drop it down. At this point, we're still in navigation mode. We need to actually switch it to landing mode. Since we're doing a visual landing, you go to this master switch here on the left, and you need to put it all the way to the right where it says landing PO. That is visual landing mode. When you set it to visual landing mode, the line is going to go away on the radar, so you're going to have to just look in front of you. Also, you can see the HUD looks a little bit different now. There's going to be this horizontal line on the HUD. You want to put this horizontal line on the base of the runway, and you want to put the velocity vector on the base of the runway too. The velocity vector is this circle right here with the lines coming out of it. This just shows where your plane is flying. So you want to have the velocity vector on the base of the runway. When you're landing, you want to have your angle of attack at about 12 or 10 or 12 degrees. If you look at this gauge right here, this is your angle of attack. This basically just shows how much the plane is pointing up. You want it to be at about 10 or 12. When you're landing, make sure you don't go below 250 kilometers per hour, then it's really easy to stall. Once you're in this position, where you have the velocity vector on the runway, you're at about 10 or 12 degrees. At that point, you are pretty much set up and you can just do whatever you're doing and bring the plane down to the runway. At this point, instead of using the stick to move the plane up and down, you can just use the throttle. By the way, if you look at your velocity vector, this will also show your AOA. This top line here will move up and down. You want the top line to be touching the circle. You can see my top line on the velocity vector is a little bit above the circle. That means my AOA is not enough. I need to pull the stick back a little bit more. If I increase my AOA a little bit, you can see now the top line is almost touching the circle. One thing to keep in note is don't go crazy trying to make sure everything is perfect. Don't try to make sure the AOA is absolutely 100% perfect. You just got to kind of land it a couple times and practice, and you'll just kind of naturally figure out how to do it. Before I touch down, I need to go over the thrust reverser. Earlier, when I showed you how to taxi, I showed you that you can use the thrust reverse lever to go backwards. When you're mid-air, if you pull the thrust reverse lever, you can see it's still green and it's going to arm it. And when you touch down, the thrust reverser will turn on. You don't have to use the thrust reverser when you're landing, but you probably should if you're landing on a very short runway. So when all your wheels hit the ground, the thrust reverser will turn on, and you can use that to slow you down. If you don't want to do that, you can also push this forward and you can just land normally, and you can use air braking to slow you down. For this landing, I'll do the thrust reverser. For my next landing, I'll do air braking. Also, when you're landing, you can turn on the automatic throttle if you want. If you come back to the left and press down on this lever, the auto throttle will come on, and you'll notice that the plane will move the throttle for you, and it will adjust the throttle to make sure you land at the right AOA. I'm not going to do the auto throttle for this landing, but I'll do it for the next one to show you how it works. All right, let's go ahead and touch down, and you can see I got the thrust reverser armed, so when I touch down, it will come on. Once you touch down, the throttle will control the power of the thrust reverser. So I'll put the throttle forward so I can slow the plane down as quick as possible. Also, there's a little light right here. If this light turns on when you're using the thrust reverser, that means that you need to bring back the power a little bit. The reason why is because gas from the thrust reverser could get into the engine intakes and it could mess up the engine. So when you're using the thrust reverser, if this light comes on, make sure you bring your throttle back a little bit. As you can see, I'm not even halfway down the runway. The thrust reverser stopped my plane super quickly. One last thing, once you've touched down and once the plane has stopped, the manual says you should set the master mode to BER, which is standby, and then you set it to nav again before you take off. It says that after you touch down, if you just leave it in nav and don't set it to BER, then it will cause some kind of problems with the navigation system. That was the visual landing. Now let's go over the navigation landing. With the visual landing, it gave us that line so we could fly kind of near the line was and try to line ourselves up with the runway, but we still had to look out the window and see where the runway was. If you do the navigation landing, the computer will help you and will bring you all the way in. You just set it up like normally. Make sure you got your coordinates entered. I'm just going to do the airport number, so I'm just going to do what I did last time, 9013. When you get everything set up like last time, you're going to click LMAL to select your landing waypoint, and when it's in nav, it's going to be the same like last time. You can see there's going to be a circle where your waypoint is, and there's going to be a line coming out showing the heading for the runway. The difference is that instead of going to the line and then turning to line up, I'm going to go ahead and set it to landing nav right now. Now don't set it to landing PO like last time. That was the visual mode. We want the landing nav mode. And when you do that, you can see it's going to move the circle. The circle is not on the airport anymore. The line is still there. The line is still lined up with the runway, but now the circle's out here. The reason why is because the plane is going to help me. It's going to fly me along the circle so I line up with this line here. If the circle's on the wrong side, your runway heading is probably just the opposite side. Just go back to this switch and switch it to BANA Grands. And if I click my LMAL button and go back to active position, you can see now the circle's on the other side. I don't want to do that because that would be for landing on the other side of the runway. I want to land on the side of the runway closer to me right now. So I'm just going to switch it back. So we're landing on runway 7. Now the circle is on the side that is closer to me. When this happens, all you need to do is you just fly, and this is your velocity vector right here. And you just want to fly, and you want to put this little dot in the velocity vector, and basically just fly where it tells you to go. This whole thing on the HUD with this dot in the middle and all these lines, if you need to turn left, this whole thing will move left, and you just fly to the left, and it basically just tells you where to go. I'm going to lower the HUD now, so it's a little bit easier to see. Once you get pretty close to the circle, you'll notice that these lines right here will jump. When they jump, that means that you need to follow them, and they're going to line you up with the runway. As you can see, they just jumped to the left. So now I'm going to follow them, and they will line me up with the runway. The lines will also take you to the right altitude. You can see the tops of all these lines are lined up with this big horizontal line. That means I'm at the right altitude. If these lines were sticking up over the horizon, that means I would be too low. And if all these lines were below the horizon line, that means I would be too high. I'm just going to follow the dot in the middle now and just go where it takes me. It just jumped to the right, so I'm going to go over to the right now. Once you get pretty close to the runway, this horizontal line is going to come up on the bottom here, and there's going to be these 3 lines. This horizontal line is going to get closer toward the middle, and once it reaches these 2 outer lines, the HUD is going to kind of change, and that is when you need to start descending down to the runway. This is the point where you want to start slowing down. You want to get to 550 kilometers per hour, and once you're at that speed, you can drop the gear down. Make sure you keep following the dot in the middle of your HUD, and it will tell you where to go. As you can see, this horizontal line is getting closer toward these middle bars now. This horizontal bar has reached these 2 outer bars right here, so the HUD should change in a second. You can see the HUD just changed. Now it's in descent mode, and it's telling me I need to point my velocity vector down to descend down to the runway. I mentioned the auto throttle before. Since I didn't use it last time, I'll use it for this landing. To turn on the auto throttle, you click this lever back here and push it down, and now the plane will be in control of the throttle. At this point, you want to do the same thing you did last time. Make sure we're about 12 degrees AOA for landing, and you want to put the velocity vector on the runway. Also keep in mind, if there's bad visibility outside, you can use your velocity vector to follow the dot, or you can follow these yellow bars on your ADI here. Just keep in mind, once you get close to the runway, it's not super accurate anymore, but it shouldn't matter because you should be close enough to where you can see the runway at that point. You see, if I follow the dot here in the middle of my HUD, it's not super accurate, but it'll still get me close enough to the runway to where I can visually see it, and then I can land manually. This whole time I haven't touched my throttle at all. The auto throttle in the plane is moving it, and it's been working completely fine so far. Last time I used the thrust reverser, so this time I'll do an air brake landing. So when I touch down, I'm going to pull back on the stick a little bit, and I'm going to have the nose pointed up, and I'm going to use the wings to slow myself down. Once I get really close to the runway, there's going to be a horizontal bar that pops up on the bottom of my HUD here. When you see that bar, you want to make sure your velocity vector is at the level of the bar or above it. If the velocity vector goes below that bar, then your plane could stall. So let me show you what that looks like. As you can see, I'm really close to the runway now, and you can see that bar came up. I want to make sure my velocity vector is on level with this bar or slightly above it. Once you've landed, you can take control of the throttle. If you move the throttle, then the auto throttle will automatically turn off. So I'm just going to move it back. And you can point the nose up a little bit, and you can air brake to slow the plane down. Once you get to around 150 kilometers per hour, you can lower the nose back onto the runway. And you can use your wheel brakes to slow yourself down. That was the navigation landing. Now let's go over the flip-flop landing. By the way, one thing I forgot to mention, when you're landing, you want to make sure you have the right altitude dialed in for your airport. If you're flying low and you're flying over land, then you can set the altimeter source to radar. In this case, I can't do it right now because I'm too high, but especially once you get pretty close to the airport, you want to set it to radar to use the radar altimeter. But if you can't do that for some reason, if you need to use the barometric altimeter, then you need to make sure you have the right altitude dialed in. If your airport is really close to the ocean, in that case, you can just use the standard pressure settings. This is the altimeter right here, If you click it right here, it'll switch it to standard, so that will zero the altimeter for the ocean. If your airbase is not near the ocean, you're going to have to dial in the barometric altimeter to the right setting or use the radar altimeter. One way you can know what the correct setting is if you go to the kneeboard. If you go to this page right here, it will show you all your waypoints plugged into your flight plan. And on your waypoints, if you look at this box here that says QFE, if there's a number in on your landing waypoint, you can dial that number in. For example, let's say my QFE said 1,500, then I would dial in the number 1,500 right here. And for those of you who are wondering, the QFE is in hectopascals. Now keep in mind that's only going to work if you have your landing waypoint plugged in the mission editor, because it will show up as your waypoint card right here. Otherwise, when you get over the land, I'd recommend just switching this to the radar altimeter. Or if you're flying over the ocean and if your airbase is near the ocean, you can just click this and set it to standard. Alright, now let's go over the flip-flop landing. The flip-flop landing is very similar to the navigation landing. The only difference is that it will line you up on the runway closer to the airport. When I set this to landing nav, you can see that this circle is out here. This circle is where I start turning to line up with the runway. The way you do the flip-flop landing is you set it to landing nav, and then you set it to landing visual, and then you set it back to landing nav. That's why it's called a flip-flop, because you flip it to visual and then flop it back to nav. And now you can see the circle is closer toward the runway. So it's going to fly me to the circle and it's going to line me up with the runway closer. And you can flip-flop back and forth as many times as you want. If I do it again, you can see now the circle's farther away. Now it's a regular nav landing. And if I do it again, you can see now the circle's closer and now it's a flip-flop landing. Other than that, the flip-flop landing is exactly the same as a navigation landing. Last thing I'm going to go over is TILS. This is kind of similar to the ILS system in American planes. This is just basically the Swedish version. At the end of some runways, there is a little device that detects your plane and it can give you information to help you land. If you want to know what airports have a TILS, you open the kneeboard and you go back to that page we were at earlier that shows all the airports. And remember, you hold right shift and click page up and page down on your keyboard to switch to all the different airports. So if I go to Kobuleti, you can see at Kobuleti, runway 250 has a TILS station 13. Right now I'm going towards runway 7, so the TILS would not work. So let me line up for runway 25. I'm lined up for runway 25. There's the airport out there. What you need to do is you need to program the TILS channel into the computer. It's most likely already programmed. When you put your landing waypoint in the computer, if you didn't manually type the coordinates in, if you just put in the code, in that case it will already be programmed. The way you can check is you make sure your landing waypoint is selected, and then set this to BANA grands, and these last two digits should be your TILS channel. And if I look at the kneeboard, you can see the channel should be 13, and it says 13 here, so I'm good. And remember, this is where we put the runway heading in. So these first four digits were for the runway heading, and the last two are the TILS channel. You can see it says 13 here, and if I check the kneeboard for Kobuleti, it should be 13, so that's good. And then when you're coming in for landing, you take this selector and make sure it's set on A for auto. In that case, the computer will look at where you're landing, it'll look at the waypoint you're landing at, and it'll see, okay, channel 13, so I'm going to dial in channel 13. Once you've gotten close enough to the runway, you'll see this little light come on that says TILS. That means that the TILS on the runway can see you. And keep in mind, TILS only works in navigation landing mode. If you do visual landing mode, it doesn't work. You have to have it in nav landing mode. And the TILS is basically just like an American ILS. You'll have these bars on your ADI and you just follow them and it will guide you down to the runway. All you do is make sure these yellow bars are lined up in the middle. And you can also use your HUD if you want to. You can just follow where the HUD shows you where to go. It's very similar to the navigation landing system. Keep in mind, the TILS is a little bit offset on the runway, so it won't bring you down perfectly to the runway. It'll actually have you a couple degrees off. It shouldn't be a big deal because even if the visibility is bad outside, once you get close to the runway, you should be able to see it with your eyes and you can land manually. You can see when I follow the TILS, it's taking me to the runway, but I'm a couple degrees off. That's normal, there's nothing wrong with it, that's just how it works. Once you get close enough to the runway to where you can see it, then you can just line up with the runway. That was taxi, takeoff, and landing in the Viggen. Thanks for checking out this video, and I'll see you later.